In this lecture, I plan to introduce you to the era of Egyptian history known as the early dynastic period. This era began in about 3000 BC and lasted up to the so-called Old Kingdom that began in about 2700 BC. But before getting into that history, I wanted to talk to you a bit about archaeology, since it is largely through archaeology that we have dug up so much about ancient Egypt, so to speak. I will show you the typical tools of the modern-day archaeologist and reveal how archaeologists date things from eras before the modern era and before modern calendars. How do we know when someone lived, for example, or when something was built, especially since no one used our dating system? Then I want to talk to you about buried cities, like those found in Egypt, and how they got buried. Then I want to reveal to you Egypt's most remarkable trait, and what effect that had on Egyptian art. And finally, we'll meet Egypt's first king, and mankind's first historical document. So we've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. What I would like to talk about here briefly first, before we get into taking a look at the early dynastic era, is how do archaeologists learn about the past? Well, basically, they got to dig it up from wherever it can be found. And usually that involves excavations. So how do they dig the past? Well, we're going to take a quick look here at the dirty world of the archaeologist, because virtually everything that they do is found under the ground, and they have to reveal it by digging it up. Now, in the past, in the early days of archaeology, that oftentimes involved simply a rather careless search for treasures, for the most part, without much regard for the actual site itself, for its preservation, or for a careful examination of things that were found there that they weren't interested in. And so oftentimes it involved large gangs of men who were being paid typically for what they might find of value, and so cared very little for anything else that was there that was not of some type of a monetary value, but could have told us or revealed things to us about the past that is now irretrievably lost. However, the world of the archaeologist today is very different. They're using tools like you see here, typically trenching shovels, brushes, brooms, trowels, dental tools, baskets for carefully carrying away loads of debris that are then sifted through very, very carefully in attempting to extract anything that might be of historical value, or that might tell the archaeologist something about the people that lived at that site. So here we see an example of the kind of places that the archaeologist works. The archaeologist's office, for example, where sitting among excavated room here as the researcher and his assistants plan out the next day's work that involves very careful investigations of the site. Then the archaeologist's social club, for example, the people that help him out, in other words, as they gather on these sites with their tools and begin very careful examination of the site, not using bulldozers and backhoes here to try to excavate these ruins, because oftentimes they're extremely fragile and have to be approached very, very carefully, recording every inch of soil that they remove practically as they try to excavate habitations or other places, looking for clues to the world that the ancient people lived in. And then on the right side, the archaeologist's playground, so to speak. Here we see the excavations that have been carried out so far in a very large Egyptian palace. And the archaeologist begins the work at a place like this while the site is typically completely buried and only evidences of its existence can be found that would encourage them to begin digging in those places. So it's an extremely tedious and very time-consuming and expensive affair today, and requires a great deal of dedication to be able to very carefully extract the secrets of these sites from their buried remains. Now the question might be, well, how do these cities get buried in the first place? Well, here we see, for example, what's called a tell. A tell is a man-made mound, and so what you're looking at here is found in Syria, I believe, or the Near East at least, and appears to be a natural elevation. In reality, it's a man-made mound. Not deliberately man-made, of course, but over the century it simply evolves into this kind of a structure. The top of this one, of course, now bears a Crusader-era castle, 12th or 13th century probably. If that could be removed, which no one would dream of doing today, but if that could be removed, and then archaeologists begin removing layers of dirt, as they proceeded down through the mound, they would find different levels of habitation. So basically what occurs here is that cities being buried, yeah, in a sense, there are cities buried, perhaps, buried inside this mound, obviously not an entire city, but the ruins of those cities. And this is a consequence of centuries of destruction and rebuilding of these urban sites. So here's an example that helps us to understand a little bit of how this happens, because if you're like me, you look at a mound like that and it's virtually incomprehensible as how this gets made. Well, again, you have to keep in mind that this covers centuries and centuries, if not millennia, of habitation at a particular site. So, for example, a group of settlers comes along and settles next to the seashore here, making shipping and trade convenient for them. Or maybe there is a spring of water here that provides water in an otherwise arid location, or perhaps it's fertile ground for herds and crops and so on. So in any case, there's something advantageous about it that causes people to settle down and begin to build an urban area. Okay? Then after some period of time, maybe centuries go by, and perhaps earthquake strikes this area and destroys the town. Well, yeah, the town has been destroyed, but the properties that were advantageous about it to begin with still exist. So they don't move away. They simply clear out the debris, leveling out the ruins, backfilling collapsed buildings or whatever, and then building on top of them, oftentimes using the foundations of the older building to serve as the foundations for the newer buildings. And so they build a new site. And let's say at some point this site becomes a target of invasion and conquest, and it gets destroyed with man-made destruction. Well, again, inhabitants don't flee and leave and abandon the place. They simply level it out again and build on top of it. Then that gets destroyed, and then build on top of that, and that gets destroyed, and so on. And the process goes on for centuries and centuries and centuries until you build up layers of debris and construction on top of one another until you create a mound like you're seeing here with this tell. Now again, it's kind of hard to visualize that, but here's again another example that I got from Time magazine some time ago that tried to explain the work of archaeologists at York in England. So let's say this is Celtic York in England, and along come the Romans in the 3rd century AD and establish a settlement there and build an urban area. At some point that gets destroyed, gets abandoned, gets disused, and perhaps that same site occupied by the Vikings of the 8th century. Okay, and so in 500 years, that much debris had built up from the time of the Romans in the 3rd century to the time of the Vikings in the 8th century. Now, this has been verified by archaeological work here. It's not just imaginative guesswork on my part. This is actually what exists beneath York in England today. So that's 8th century York during the Viking period. And then over 700 years, this much debris had built up, until we get to medieval York in the 15th century. And then we've got 20th century York, so 500 years later, not much debris is built up there for whatever reason, but nevertheless, as an archaeologist, if you were to dig down through modern day York beneath that shopping center, that imaginary shopping center, if you were to dig down through it, you would reach Roman York about 30 feet below modern day York. And so what has happened over the intervening centuries is layers of occupation, debris, destruction, rebuilding, and so on, until finally you have built up that much debris in that particular inhabited area. So here's another example. This is a little model of the Pantheon in Rome. And we're looking at the model here in the landscape as it existed at the time of ancient Rome. Now here we see the corner of the Pantheon here, and of course at its base is the level of ancient Rome, because the Pantheon still stands in its original location here and is still in use. And so it has been kept clear of debris, but around it, notice how much debris has arisen around it to where these students are here. This is the street level of modern day Rome. So that much debris has built over centuries of time between ancient Rome and modern day Rome. Here's another example. This is from Jerusalem. So what we're looking at here is the western wall of the Temple Mount, or the so-called Wailing Wall. So off to the north here of the wall, you see these 3 arches. And so this is the level of Jerusalem today. So here's an illustration of the way this area of Jerusalem would have looked at the time of Christ, so 1st century. And if you look at the so-called Wilson's Arch, that's this one here, is Wilson's Arch. If you look at it, you can see that it's much taller in those days. And then the 2 arches to the side, you can see what we see today is just the topmost portions of those arches. Okay, so where did all this debris come from that filled up this area clear up to this point here that we see today? Well, basically it's from the Roman destructions at the time of the conquest of Jerusalem during the Jewish Wars, and in subsequent debris built up over the years. The thing that is kind of humorous about this from my point of view is that when Christians go to Jerusalem today to walk in the footsteps of Christ, they're nowhere near the footsteps of Christ, because virtually all of Jerusalem has risen, just like in the view that we see here of Rome, has risen 20 or 30 feet because of all the debris that has accumulated there. And so the footsteps of Christ are long since buried under 20 feet of debris. Still, it's the idea that counts, I suppose, right? Another critical bit of information that archaeologists must ferret out of their sites is, how do they date things that they find, that they discover? There's no calendar that's available for them. There's nothing that tells them dates, even if they find documents. Those documents rarely contain a date that has any meaning in the modern world, if it has a date at all. In fact, usually any kind of dating that might be contained in a document would be a reference to something else that occurred, such as in the 5th year of the reign of King Josiah, Egypt invaded Canaan, that sort of thing. So when did Egypt invade Canaan? Well, 5 years after Josiah came to the throne. Okay, well, when did Josiah come to the throne? Well, there's no according that date. So how do you get dates from these ancient worlds? It's a burning question that occupies much of the time of archaeologists as they try to study these sites and ferret out their secrets. So there are two ways, basically, that archaeologists use to date things that they find at these sites. One is called absolute dating, and the other one is called relative dating. Now, absolute dating includes such things as carbon-14 dating, thermoluminescence dating, and dendrochronology. So let's just look briefly at each one of these, not going into them in any particular depth, but just giving you an idea of what is involved here. So with carbon-14, it's a question of measuring the amount of decay of radioactive isotopes in organic material. So by using scientific instrumentation today and calculations, archaeologists and scientists are able to figure out how long ago something organic lived by measuring the amount of decay in their radioactive isotopes. Now, I'm not going to go into an explanation of how that works because I only partially understand it myself, but you can look it up on the internet if you're interested. The point here is it has to have some organic material, like bone or wood or cloth or whatever might have survived over the centuries that has been recovered from the dig. Then processes can be performed on that material to discover how long ago it lived. Now, this process is good for the past 50,000 years. However, it doesn't work very well for recent events, say within the last few centuries. You have to use different dating for that sort of thing. Thermoluminescence is dating something by measuring the number of photons released in crystalline materials that have been heated in the past. Okay, and so this would be good for things like pottery, ceramics that have been recovered from a dig. And fortunately, pottery has a very high rate of survivability, and so this is oftentimes one of the most common kinds of artifacts that are found in digs is bits and pieces of pottery. Shattered sherds, for example, that the archaeologists can subject to this testing and can determine when this piece of pottery had been baked in a kiln. Now, by the way, just a side point here, when you use the word sherd, it refers to fragments of pottery. When you use the word shard, it refers to fragments of glass. So sherds and shards, okay? The third one is dendrochronology, and this involves measuring years through growth in rings and trees. And so the idea here is that you have to have some wood, perhaps a beam of wood that has been recovered from a shipwreck, and cutting through that wood reveals the rings, and then as you probably know, you count those rings, and because the tree adds one ring for every year of growth, and so you sometimes see representations like this where this big tree began growing in 909 AD. Then as you count the rings, you see the various dates that are associated with it. And so by counting growth rings is another way to arrive at some absolute dating. Now, none of these will give you a specific year and month, of course, but they get you within the ballpark of when something was created or when something lived. Now, the other one is relative dating, and quite frankly, I think this is probably used most commonly in dating archaeological digs. One is stratigraphy, the other one astronomical phenomena. So by stratigraphy, we mean as archaeologists dig down through a site, they can look at the edges of the dig, like we see here on this excavation here, and you investigate the layers of soil that have been deposited over the ages. And so you can clearly see here different layers of habitation. So down here, covered up with the grass, is a very early site because the oldest layers are the deepest layers. And then so you have a site down here, maybe even deeper than that, but at least in this particular example, we begin here, then layers of debris, and then another habitation layer here, then more layers of debris, another habitation layer, and more layers of debris, and then finally our modern day layer. Archaeologists can use this kind of stratigraphy in order to arrive at relative dates, because over the years, archaeologists, depending on the site, have determined how long it takes typically to build up certain layers of debris. Okay? Now that works unless the soil has been disturbed, like we see over here where this modern day pipe is buried in the ground. And you can see that the soil on either side of where this trench was dug is different than the soil in the trench itself. And so archaeologists can determine when the soil has been disturbed, say for a burial or something like that, that digs down through the layers and disrupts this stratification. And then you have to determine when that burial was made, maybe through carbon-14 or something of that nature. So we have the modern day layer there, the occupation layer there, another occupation layer there, and then the modern pipe that disturbs that stratigraphy. Now the other one is the astronomical phenomena. Now this one is used quite frequently, strangely enough, and that is because when some observation of something unusual that happens in the heavens occurs, usually that's recorded, at least by societies that have developed writing. Okay? And so astronomical phenomena are useful for dating something in relationship to a known astronomical phenomenon. So for example, this from the Old Testament, the book of Joel, it says, "The sun shall be turned to darkness." Okay, well, what's Joel describing here is the sun is turned to darkness. Well, of course, that would be a solar eclipse that was observed and was recorded. Or here's another example, a burning torch for the entire night by Diodorus Siculus, a Greek writer or historian. So what's he talking about here? A burning torch that exists for the entire night. Well, the logical assumption is that was a comet. So whenever in the ancient world these kinds of astronomical phenomenon were observed, they were oftentimes, more often than we suspect, recorded by the peoples that lived at that time. Okay? And so the thing that's significant about that is that today scientists can date a particular event like that. Solar eclipse, comets that came by the Earth and that sort of thing, those can be dated with a fair degree of accuracy today, no matter how long ago they occurred, because they typically occur at regular kinds of intervals. And so if a solar eclipse occurs somewhere, scientists can, depending on the, so in the case of Joel, he obviously living in Palestine, in the Canaan, and so scientists today are able to determine when solar eclipses occurred at that place in the Earth that could have been observed, thereby creating a date from which events can be related, either dating from that time or from before that time, but you have a date to begin with. So here's my hypothetical example. Now this is purely hypothetical. So since we're talking about Egypt, when you open up a textbook on Egypt and you read about the pyramids, they typically give you a date for when that was built. Well, how do scholars know that? How do they know when the Great Pyramid was built? Because the Egyptians never said when it was built, never identified a particular year when it began and when it was finished. Okay, and even if they did, how would those years relate to our years, to our date? So oftentimes that type of dating in the ancient world was based on monarchs or pharaohs' reigns. So a scribe writing a history of his pharaoh might say, well, such and such a thing happened in the 3rd year of the reign of the pharaoh. Okay, so you now have a date as this thing happened 3 years after so-and-so became a pharaoh. But how do we know when he became a pharaoh? That's the question. So here's my example. When was the Great Pyramid built? Now keep in mind this is totally fake. I'm just making this up. But I'm not making this part up, and that is that here are some facts that we know from records that were kept in ancient Egypt that have been recovered. And that is the pharaoh. We know the name of the pharaoh. That was the pharaoh Khufu. Okay? Sometimes he's known by his Greek name of Cheops, but we're going to go with the Egyptian version of these pharaohs' names. And so the pharaoh we know was Khufu. We also know that the construction of the pyramid took place over a 40-year span. Okay? So typically, pharaohs began the construction of their pyramids, their burial places, when they became pharaoh, so that by the time they died, which was unpredictable, whenever they died, they would ideally have their tomb already prepared for them, like we talked about when we were talking about mummification, so that the pharaoh could be buried in a properly prepared tomb. Okay, so construction took 40 years. But when did Khufu come to the throne? Well, here, this is the part that I'm making up. Let's say that this inscription was found somewhere, maybe in a tomb or on a temple wall or something, in which it says, "In the first year of Khufu, beloved of Horus, the sacred enterprise of his eternal house," the pyramid, "was blessed by the good god, Horus, when the eye of Osiris dwelt in the heavens, filling the skies with divine fire for 5 nights. So, in this particular case, the scribe recorded the fact that in the first year of Khufu, the first year of Khufu's reign, the eye of Horus was seen in the sky, dwelling there for 5 nights. Well, obviously, what could the eye of Horus have been? Well, makes sense that it would be a comet. So here I found this very interesting comet on the internet. It looks kind of like a divine eye, the eye of Horus, so to speak. And so we've got a comet here, the date of which could be accurately established by scientific records of today, okay, scientific methods, because comets come by the Earth in regular intervals. So that comet, the appearance of that comet can be datable today then. So let's say that a likely candidate appeared over Egypt in 2640 BC, okay, our own date. Therefore, since the pyramid took 40 years to build, and his reign began in 2640, that first year when the comet appeared, the pyramid was then finished 40 years later in 2600 BC. So we've got 2 dates here using relative dating that is also based on astronomical observation of astronomical phenomena as to when Khufu began his reign and when the pyramid was finished. Now that is the date that we believe Khufu began reigning, but I don't know how that was established. I just made that part up. But in any case, we've got 2 dates here that we can use then. So this provides us with dates from which historical events can then be dated, either so many years before Khufu's reign, or so many years after his reign, or after the pyramid was built, or before it was built, or whatever. We now have relative dating of historical events. Okay, so here's another hypothetical example of mine. So let's say that on Crete, as many of you may be familiar with a royal palace on Crete called Knossos that has been excavated. And let's say that archaeologists wanted to date when these pots were discovered at an excavation in the palace. So when were these pots created? Now, if you could date when the pots were created, then you can date everything at the palace that was discovered at that same level, okay, in terms of excavations. So let's say, again, hypothetically, in 1856, 19th century, an Egyptian nobleman's tomb in the Delta was found and opened up. And papyrus documents found in the tomb indicated that that nobleman lived a century after the completion of Khufu's tomb. Okay, so no particular date here, but it's recorded that he lived 100 years after the pyramid was completed. Therefore, he lived around 2500 BC, okay, 100 years after the pyramid was built. Now again, this tomb also, let's say, contained a Minoan trade vessel, because the Egyptians traded frequently with the Minoans that lived on Crete. And let's say this was the pot that was found in the tomb. Well, so that pot had to have been made about 2500 BC, right? Okay. So that was also could be verified by thermoluminescence, since it's ceramic. It could be verified through that scientific procedure. Now let's say that at Knossos, a fragment of pot was found in that storage pit where those other pots were, and it looked like this. Now that's not the case, but let's say that it was. Okay. Well, obviously the design is so similar to the design that was found in the nobleman's tomb that it had to be discovered, or it had to be created at the same time. Therefore, everything at the level of excavation on Crete at which that fragment was found can be dated to 2500 BC. Okay, so that's the method by which archaeologists arrive at dating objects, and then looking at the style of things and comparing them to the style of other things that have been discovered in other places of a known date and so on. So it's all relative and gives us a general idea of when something was created. It's never perfectly accurate, but it gives us a sense of the period of time when things were created as they are extracted from these excavations. Okay, so let's get to Egypt. One of the most remarkable characteristics of ancient Egypt that is noted by archaeologists and historians and art historians today is its very remarkable changelessness. Now, this is considered to be one of Egypt's most remarkable traits. In other words, over its entire span of history, its artwork, and we're talking here primarily about artwork and architecture, its artwork virtually never changed. So we're going to take a look here at sculpture and painting in this regard. Now, of course, as you look at these two images, a relief sculpture and a painting, you can see that in these two different art forms, this changelessness is fairly evident as well. Same kind of approach, same type of poses, same type of imagery is being used, whether it's sculpture, relief sculpture, or whether it's painting. Now, of course, full figure sculpture will be different, but for the most part, relief and painting, very, very similar. So the thing that's most remarkable from the point of view of historians is how long Egypt lasted. So here's our timeline from 3000 BC to 30 BC, so 3,000 years of time. So for nearly 3,000 years, originality, change, and innovation were notably absent from Egyptian art. So apparently, once a satisfactory solution artistically had been found, it remained virtually unchanged throughout the rest of Egyptian history. Now the question is, for such an advanced culture, why was that the case, right? You would expect evolution, you would expect developmental changes, you would expect going from primitive to sophisticated. But that doesn't seem to be the case with the Egyptians. Once a satisfactory solution had been found, and I'm going to show you one of the very first satisfactory solutions to figure work, it then remains virtually unchanged for the rest of Egypt's 3,000-year history. The obvious question again is, why was that the case? So I wanted to compare this to Western artistic development. So here is a painting from ancient Rome in the 2nd century AD. Here's a Byzantine painting 400 years later. And notice it's quite different. Okay? Here's a painting from the Middle Ages 400 years later. Okay? 10th century AD. Here's Proto-Renaissance, 14th century. And look at the style as we go through these. Look at the style of each painting and how different it is from another painting that was only a few hundred years earlier. So here's early Renaissance, here's high Renaissance, and Baroque in the 17th century. Now as we look at these images, it seems perfectly natural to us that you go from something more primitive to something more sophisticated. That there is an obvious sequence of a development that occurs where things get better and better, or at least changes significantly from one era to the other, sometimes within the same era. So here's the neoclassical style from 18th century, realism in the 19th century, and for the Western art, from the 19th century onward, these changes accelerate dramatically. So here's another one from the 19th century, very different from the one I just showed you. Again, another 19th century post-impressionist, very different from the others of the same century. Another post-impressionist, 19th century. Another one, okay? Notice how each one is very different. Then we get into the early 20th century with neoplasticism, and this is completely different than anything we've ever seen before in Western art. Early 20th century. Another one from the early 20th century. And finally, this one from the early 20th century that represents a complete departure from anything that we've seen so far. And then, well, that wasn't finally. And then abstract expressionism from the mid-20th century. And then finally, photorealism from the late 20th century. Not that this is the primary method of expression today, but just is a method of artistic expression. Now you look at those and how very different all of that is. So as you go through the entire gamut of artwork, that represents 2,000 years of development. That's a long time, of course, but the point is that it changes dramatically from the beginning to the end, and oftentimes within the same century, changing over and over and over again. That's 2,000 years. Okay? Now for Egypt, we've got 3,000 years, a whole nother 1,000 years. And yet, let's look at the changes that occurred here. Okay? So here, for example, is an Egyptian relief sculpture showing a pharaoh in what's called the smiting pose. He's got his mace in his hand. He's about ready to bash his enemy on the head. Okay? That was from about 3100 BC, the early dynastic era, the very earliest period of Egyptian history. Here is a temple facade relief from 246 BC, also the smiting pose. Now notice here you got nearly 3,000 years span of time here, but the pose is virtually the same thing. Right? Slightly different, but for the most part, no innovation here and no development for the most part. So let's look at some intervening sculptures, either from temple facades or relief sculptures. So smiting pose here, smiting pose, smiting pose, smiting pose, and smiting pose. So how much change is there from 3000 BC to 246 BC? Well, again, some very minor little adjustments perhaps, but for the most part, the art has not changed. It has not gotten better. It has not gotten more realistic. It has not gotten more sophisticated. It's virtually the same thing from beginning to end. Okay, and that represents 3,000 years of development, or of time that has passed. No real development there, because it stays the same. So the question, again, can't overemphasize the question, is why does this remain changeless? One of Egypt's most remarkable traits, when it comes to art in particular. Well, I would suggest to you that one of the reasons that they strive to do this, and it's a deliberate choice, of course, on the part of the Egyptian patrons that are commissioning this kind of artwork and the artists that are producing it. So one of the reasons is to create an understandable iconography, so they can look at it and understand what it means. So here's an example. Let's compare it to the West. So here's an example that probably most of you recognize from Norman Rockwell, a very famous painting of his from 1946, okay, so mid-20th century. And we look at this, and the question is, what is the message that Norman Rockwell is trying to communicate here with this Thanksgiving scene? Well, you can come up with your own explanation of the message, with a family gathered around the Thanksgiving dinner table. And we know that it's Thanksgiving. Why? Because of the Thanksgiving turkey that's there. Grandma and Grandpa are presiding over the family gathering. How do we know that they're Grandma and Grandpa? Well, we can kind of identify that with our traditional idea of what grandmas and grandpas look like, as well as these happy family members gathered around the Thanksgiving table. So we can interpret this fairly easily, and this is from 1943. So what, 70 years ago? Okay, so let's compare that to this one. This is an early Christian image from the 6th century AD. Okay, now we can recognize some things here. This seems to be a religious subject. For example, we do have a guy wearing a halo, which we can recognize. This individual is carrying a cross over his shoulder, so perhaps something associated with Christ, or at least Christian religion. But what's the rest of it dealing with? What are those strange muffin-like things in the background? Why is he standing on the head of a lion, on the head of a snake? And what's that book in his hand? Why has he got a cloth covering his hand, and so forth? I mean, there are a lot of things. We can recognize some basics here. But what is the full meaning of it? Well, this is 1,300 years ago, and it's hard for us to understand parts of it. Here's another one from 15th century. Okay, so 500 years ago. And what have we got here? Well, again, we can recognize some parts of it. There seems to be some kind of a ceremony taking place here, but what is the meaning of it? What's this guy doing with his hand raised? Why is the woman wearing this green dress that's been lifted up over her stomach? What's a dog doing here? Why are their sandals off? Well, again, the question is, we can recognize some of this, but a full interpretation of it, kind of difficult. And that was just 400 years ago. Okay? And of course, in our own century, 1910, just 100 years ago. What does this mean? Well, I would suggest that most of you would have a very difficult time interpreting this painting. This is only 100 years old. What does the painting represent? Why is it done in this way, and so on? Okay, so here again, as we look at these images from our Western culture, where change is a characteristic feature of our culture, we have a hard time interpreting most of these, right? At least completely, and they're not that far removed from our own era. So what were the Egyptians trying to do? Well, they're trying to create an understandable iconography that didn't change from era to era or from artist to artist. Now also another aspect of this changelessness This deliberate changelessness might be in order to give visible form to the belief in the eternal nature of things. Now, many of you that are taking this class may be artists, and so if you were given an assignment, a painting assignment or a drawing assignment, to try to represent visually the concept of the eternal nature of things, what would you do? How would you represent that? What kind of imagery would you make in order to represent a belief in the eternal nature of things? Now, it's easy to represent people or things or events or something physical like that and concrete in that way, but how do you represent a concept, right? Like a belief in the eternal nature of things. Well, this changelessness is Egypt's way of visibly representing their belief in the eternal nature of things, which is central to their society from the beginning, as we talked about. Now, here's just another couple of examples of how artists use their artwork in order to communicate a message. So the question is what's the message here? With the Venus de Milo, most of you are familiar with this famous Greek sculpture. What's the artist trying to communicate to us with this piece, as opposed to what is he trying to communicate with this other piece? Okay. Well, some suggestions that I could make relative to the Venus de Milo is maybe the concepts he's talking about here are the eternal, something that's unchanging, focusing on beauty, celebration of life, and doing that through this idealized, not realistic, idealized portrait. Okay, so this isn't a real woman, right? This is a symbol of the eternal unchangelessness of womanhood, let's say. So trying to represent a concept through this universally idealized figure. On the other hand, the one on the right, the artist might be trying to suggest the mortal, the changeability of life, the ugliness that we find in life, the vicissitudes of life. So just the opposite of the Venus de Milo with this old market woman. Okay? And so they have a very different message they're trying to communicate here in the type of imagery that they are employing. Now, how does this relate to Egypt? Well, here we see a typical Egyptian pharaoh in which that idealized universal image is being used in order to exploit what? In order to try to communicate the pharaoh's nature. He's noble, he's serene, he's unchanging. Now, if you remember back to our first lecture, for the Egyptian, what status did the pharaoh hold? Well, he's not just an ordinary man. He was God on earth, right? So you're not going to represent him like the old woman there, right? If you represented the man as that individual, as the individual that occupied the throne, as he grew older and more decrepit and aged and careworn, his appearance would change, right? To be something like, akin to the old market woman. But he doesn't. He remains more like the Venus de Milo, unchanging, eternal. Okay? Get my point here? So what they're trying to represent is an individual that's godlike, and so they use an universal image to do that, because a universal image is one that doesn't change. It's universal and eternal and changeless. Okay? So the idea here is that the artist, in the service of the pharaoh, is trying to represent the idea of pharaohness. And what is pharaohness for the Egyptian? It's godlike, right? Trying to represent a god on earth, not the man who was the pharaoh, okay, but the God who was the pharaoh. And so you're going to use a very different approach with your sculpture and your artwork when representing that kind of subject matter like we see here. And as we examine Egyptian, especially Egyptian pharaonic art, you'll see that there's that consistency that's maintained from century to century to century because the idea doesn't change. And so the artwork that expresses the idea doesn't change either. Okay? So changelessness, one of the most remarkable traits of Egyptian art. But as we talk about it from this point of view, we begin to understand why. It's not because they're not innovative or they're not creative or they're not capable. It's because they have a particular message they're trying to communicate, and that message remains the same throughout 3,000 years. Now remember, I think I've mentioned before that typically, this isn't just with the Egyptians, but typically any religious society is resistant to change, right? Look back through the centuries and I think you can identify that. And why is that? It's primarily because religious societies embrace truth, and truth never changes, right? And so if that is foundational to your belief, then you don't easily accept a lot of change, because if you did, then what you were doing before wasn't right, right? And so you don't change it because you believe that what you did before was truth in itself, and that same truth is true now, right? So, and of course, if nothing else, Egypt was a religious society, okay, based on religion. As Herodotus says, the Egyptian was religious to excess, all right? Okay, so let's now talk about how they did this. How did they maintain this consistency? Because I would say that today, among artists today, trying to maintain the consistency is something that is not acceptable. In other words, if you as an artist, if you're an artist, a painter, I suspect that your teacher does not want you painting like somebody else. Want you to be different, want you to be innovative, want you to be creative. It becomes the hallmark for modern day artists. That's not the case with the Egyptian artist. They weren't trying to be innovative and creative and develop a reputation of their own for innovation and creativity. Instead, they're trying to maintain the status quo. And so their teachers wanted them to do work just like the artists in the previous generation. So how did they promote that? Well, basically, the Egyptian artists, especially when it came to figure art, relied upon a canon, what's called a canon of proportion, rules of proportion. So rules of proportion and pose. So here you see some diagrams, modern day diagrams, to try to illustrate this point. Whether you're standing still, whether you're seated on a throne, whether you're striding forward, you place the figure on a grid system, and everything is based on the grid. So the artist, the Egyptian artist, when he had to paint a pharaoh or a god seated on a throne, he goes to his little style book, opens up, leafs through it until he finds, okay, here's the page on how to do someone seated on a throne. It involves this many grids tall, this many grids wide, and so on, okay? So that's the way they would do it. That's the way they would maintain their consistency. Now, oftentimes these figure poses are actually based on hieroglyphs, interestingly enough. And so the very pose itself, the positioning of the arms and so forth, are actually based on hieroglyphs, and experts in hieroglyphics can identify the deeper meaning of the pose because of the hieroglyph that it was based upon. But the whole point is to establish a standard that never changes and to maintain the consistency from artist to artist and throughout the ages. Again, the point is to represent the changelessness of eternity, not of earth life. Earth life changes from day to day, from year to year. But the Egyptian, remember, I think I mentioned earlier as well that, again, according to some scholars, for the Egyptian, life is just a way of getting to death, the eternities. Get through the mortal testing phase in order to be able to pass into the eternities where life begins, in a sense, right? For the eternities. And so the Egyptian artist is not interested in trying to represent life on earth. What they're trying to represent is an iconographic representation of life in the eternities, in a sense, and the symbolizing of that eternal nature in the art that they're creating. So that helps us to understand the artwork a little bit better. And again, so when we look at these images, you have to kind of give up on the idea that they're doing this because they can't do any better. They're working this way because they're not smart enough to figure out realism. Realism is based on earth life. These kinds of images are ways of representing the universal, okay? And that too explains the kind of pose that the Egyptian artist uses. And we may address this later as well when we look at some paintings, but the idea here is that in creating this universal image, what they're trying to do in this rather strange kind of configuration of the body, where you've got this rather flat image. It's flat, of course, because it's being painted on a flat surface, so where I create the illusion that it's not flat when it really is, so the truth of the flatness of it. But also you look at the torso, it's facing frontally, right? But the head is profile. But you look at the eye and it's frontal. You look at the feet and their profile, and so on. So it's this combination figure, and the intention of which is to take all of the most characteristic and identifiable features of a human body and combine them into a single image. Again, to represent a concept of mankind, or of man, instead of the changeable nature of man in the real world. So that helps us to understand a little bit of why figures look the way they do with this rather simplistic representation. What they're trying to do is express the changelessness of eternity in their artwork. And that is central to Egyptian art. So if you want this term to understand why Egyptian art looks the way that it does, and they approached it the way that they did, keep that in mind. That is basic to all of their artwork. So whenever you are evaluating a work of Egyptian art, keep in mind, how does that express the idea of eternity and the changelessness of it? Okay, so here, for example, let me just illustrate how they might have decorated a tomb. So these are some images that I took 100 years ago when I took my tour to spend a week in Egypt. And in Cairo, there's a tourist park where you can board a canal boat, and you travel through various recreated scenarios of ancient Egypt. Okay? So at one point they try to illustrate how a tomb was decorated. So here you have a young Egyptian worker that is roughing out the surface of a rock-cut tomb. Okay, these are the type of tombs that would be dug in the cliffs along the west side of the Nile River near Thebes. So here he is. They've excavated the tunnel leading down to the burial chamber, and now you got this young guy here that's roughing out the surface. Then you have this young fellow that is smoothing the surface so it can be painted upon. Carved relief and then painted the relief and so on. Then over here you have, after it's all been smoothed out, you have the worker that's laying out the grid that's going to control the way the figure looks. And then finally, the artist who is applying the images to that figure according to the rules. Okay? Whatever rule book they had, who knows if they had a rule book, literally, or whether it's just the training that they went through as apprentices. Anyway, drawing the images. Now, if that seems rather strange to you and maybe don't really believe it, here are some examples from tombs themselves that show this being used. So here's an unfinished painting Usually these are sculpted out and then painted, or could just be painted with fresco right on the wall. In case you see the grid work here done in red chalk and a little bit of the figure that's beginning to appear. Here's one that is more complete, where you can still see the grid that the figure was placed upon. And then finally this one that's unfinished, but you can see the beginning of the carving, very shallow relief carving. Again, the point is, they're all based on this grid system. Okay. All right, so now let's turn our attention to the early dynastic era. So here's our timeline. We're going to be focusing on the early dynastic period, around 3000 BC, so the 4th millennium. All right, so in the beginning, during the early dynastic era, we have Egypt that consisted of 2 separate kingdoms, like I talked about in an earlier lecture. You've got Lower Egypt, which consisted primarily of the Delta, okay? Then you had Upper Egypt, which was the rest of Egypt, down south all the way to the what's so-called cataracts. These are a series of waterfalls that basically separated southern Egypt from Nubia, from the areas to the south. Okay, so in early dynastic era, prior to the coming of the first pharaoh, Egypt is controlled by 2 different kings, one in the north and one in the south, okay? Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Now remember I told you in the earlier discussion that whenever Egypt was unified, it was always the forces from Upper Egypt that conquered Lower Egypt, maybe because of the hardier type of individual that was bred in that desert environment, as opposed to the softer living individuals of Lower Egypt. I don't know, but nevertheless that always seemed to be the case. So we've got 2 kingdoms, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Now each is ruled over by his own king. Now we don't know the name of the king of Lower Egypt. He's unknown. However, we do know the king of Upper Egypt. We do know his name, and his name is Narmer. And I'm going to show you in just a moment how we know what his name is. Okay, it's from a document that we have from that period of time, and it's this document. Okay, so this is called the Palette of Narmer. And what you see on it is a pharaoh in the striking pose, like we talked about earlier, represented as dominating his foes. So we want to take a closer look at this palette because it's a very important work of art in Egyptian history. So the so-called Palette of Narmer. This is a ceremonial plaque, okay, carved in relief, a very thin slab of stone that is approximately 2 feet high and about 1.5 feet wide, okay? It's in the Cairo Museum today. What this is important for is because it records some very important information about this early dynastic period and the military unification of Egypt. So what we've got here at the top is the royal name. Now earlier I told you that royal names were contained within cartouches, that oval rope shape tied to a stick, inside of which is the hieroglyphs for the royal name. Well, that didn't exist at this time. So what we have here is something that's called the serek. The serek is the royal name. Okay, it contains the royal name. It contains hieroglyphs and images that relate to the royal name. So what we're looking at here is a gated facade of a palace. So this rectangular structure that you see here represents the gated facade of the royal palace, inside of which are a couple of images identifying who occupies that royal palace. Now this upper image you can tell clearly is a fish, and if you look closely at it, it can be identified as a catfish. Okay, and then this item down here, a little bit harder to tell, but it's a chisel tied to a handle of wood. That's a chisel. And so in Egyptian, the term for catfish was nar, okay? And you can guess what the term for chisel was. That, of course, is myrrh. So the combination of the two is narmer. So that's the royal name here on this palette of Narmer. I'll explain to you in a minute why we call it a palette when we look at the back side of it that is also carved. Okay. So what the significance historically of this palette of Narmer is that it is the world's first historical document. Okay. In it, it establishes the convention for figural representations for the next 3,000 years. Okay, so whoever this artist was that generated these images, he was going to have a very long period of influence. Next 3,000 years for the most part, every artist is going to follow his conventions, whoever it was. And we never know because Egyptian artists never signed their names to anything they ever made because they were always just artisans in the service of a patron deity or royal pharaoh or whatever, or noblemen, so they never signed their names. They weren't important. They were just workmen. In any case, we have here, it's kind of a very early version of the figure work, but you can see all the conventional elements. The forward-facing torso, the profile head, the frontal eyes, side feet, etc. All those elements are there. So this is establishing the conventions for doing a figure that's going to stay persistent for the next 3,000 years. Okay, so what it does is represent Pharaoh as a divine ruler. Okay? And we'll identify a couple of elements here that indicate that for him. So in terms of a historical document, this palette records the uniting militarily of Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay, so Narmer takes his military forces, marches down the river and conquers the delta, gets rid of the king whose name is not recorded, and makes himself pharaoh or king over the entire valley. Now pharaoh, we always call these kings pharaoh. They're just kings, right? But we always call them pharaohs. Pharaoh was the Egyptian word that means basically great house. So basically the term is associated with the great palace that the king lives in. So the word pharaoh is the word that we use to describe an Egyptian king. Okay, so this palette records the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt. In terms of the conventions, we see this composite figure that I just referred to, the combination of frontal and profile views. Now again, I suggest to you that the reason, and the Egyptians weren't the only people that did this. Most cultures of the ancient world, you look at the cultures of Mesopotamia, they use these same conventions. Did they all get together in a conference and decide what to do? I don't know how that worked. But it just so happens that they all use about the same type of conventions. Is there cross-pollination between cultures in terms of how to do these things? Don't know that we can identify that or establish that. In any case, 3000 BC, this is what the Egyptians are doing. And so the composite figure again combines basically all the most characteristic features of the human figure into a single image. Now let me just address that for a moment here because, well, it's easy to understand the torso, why this is the most identifiable view of the torso, the frontal view. Because if you turn sideways and the image is portrayed from a side view, that's not very identifiable. The parts and pieces are not very identifiable. It's more identifiable from the front. Okay, and certainly that's the case of feet. For years I taught figure drawing, and I can tell you that one of the hardest things for students to draw, and even for myself, quite frankly, is a foot that's not seen in the side view, a foot that's coming towards you or in a 3/4 view. Very hard to draw. Why? Because it doesn't look like a foot. And so it's hard to draw it. But a foot is perfectly identifiable from the side. And so that's its most characteristic feature. Same way with the hands. They're almost always shown in kind of a a view that shows all the fingers or the shape of the hand and that sort of thing. And then when it comes to the head, of course, this is the part that most people who don't know any better make fun of, and that is you're combining a profile head with a frontal eye. Now, why profile head? Well, again, I would argue that it is from the profile that we have the most characteristic and identifiable elements. From the front, the shape of the head is just kind of an oval. That's not very identifiable, quite frankly. Not very characteristic in terms of its features, but from the side, you get these very identifiable configurations: brow, eye socket, nose, lips, chin, and so forth, that are clearly characteristic from the side. On the other hand, what does an eye look like from the side? Well, it doesn't look like an eye. It looks like a sideways V with a little oval curve in it, right? But from the front, it looks like an eye. It's identifiable. So that's what the artist is doing, is taking all the most characteristic features and combining them into this composite figure. And this will be the convention for the next 3,000 years. Another thing that we see here is the use of registers. Registers are these horizontal zones, basically, that the composition is divided into. So in this case, one register serves as kind of the ground plane for the pharaoh to be standing upon, but it's a way of organizing a picture plane is through registers. Okay? And then the hierarchic scale. What we mean by hierarchic scale is that the most important things are the biggest things. And so whenever you look at an ancient Egyptian work of art, you can always tell immediately who the most important people are, okay, because they're the biggest. By comparison, if you look at a painting today, for example, how do you know who the most important people are that are in it, that are portrayed in it, if you don't know who they are and what their status is and what their position in society is or whatever? Well, there are little devices that artists today can use to kind of focus attention on what is considered to be the most important person or the center of interest, but sometimes it's kind of hard to determine. But when you look at an Egyptian work of art, it's absolutely clear right from the get-go as to who the most important person is because of hierarchic scale. They're always the biggest people. And then typically, in descending order of size, you get down to the less important people. So we've got the pharaoh who is dominating the entire composition here, and then his enemy. Not that the enemy is an important person, because he's a pretty good sized figure as well, but of course you have to have him in consistent scale with the pharaoh or it wouldn't look right. But here is the pharaoh's assistant, maybe his vizier or his chamberlain or whatever, and look how small he is. And then some enemies down here that are of a small size as well. So hierarchic scale is established in this palette. And this convention is going to be used throughout the next 3,000 years. Then in terms of the pharaoh as divine ruler, what does this artist come up with in order to represent the fact that as you look at this, how do you know that who the pharaoh is? How do you know that he's a divine ruler? Well, it's kind of hard to identify his divinity necessarily, but you know that he's certainly important, like a minor deity would be, because of his heroic scale, so much larger than everyone else, and standing in a very heroic kind of presentation as well. Okay? Then also, if you look closely at this, you can see some bull symbolism. Now, I bring out bull symbolism here because in the ancient world, I think we talked about this earlier on when we were talking about the horns on the head of Moses, right? And that is, in the ancient world, bulls in many cultures were considered to be, or were held in very high regard and considered to be symbols of divinity in many ways. And this is very true of Egypt. They had a bull called the Apis bull that was revered as a divine creature, and we'll talk more about him later on. But in the ancient world, bull symbolism was often associated with divinity. So in the case of Moses with the horns on his head, that's what we were talking about there, coming down from Mount Sinai, having been in the presence of God for 40 days, and having acquired some of his divine characteristics, briefly at least, right? As symbolized through the bull symbolism. So here with the palette of Narmer, we have bull symbolism, not in horns and so on, but rather, if you look closely, we'll have a closer view here in just a moment, but if you look closely, you see he's wearing a kilt with a belt, and tied to that belt is a bull's tail, comes right down there behind his leg. And so there's your bull symbolism. And you'll notice that if you look carefully, you'll see that on many pharaohs, they'll have that symbol of divinity. Okay, so bull symbolism. Then, of course, divine ruler, because he is dominating his enemies here. Poor creature here has absolutely no hope at all of survival. So not only is he dominating this guy and about ready to bash him with his war mace here, but treading on his enemies down below. So he is solely responsible here for the defeat of his enemies in uniting these two kingdoms. And finally, he's being attended by this hawk. That's Horus, the sky god or the sun god, the son of Osiris and Isis. And so we'll look at this a little bit closer too in just a moment, but we have Horus standing on this representation of papyrus reeds, okay? So the papyrus marshes of the delta, and Horus is perched upon them as though dominating those. And then in this little ground plane here, we've got a representation of the people of the delta who are being carried away captive or held captive by Horus, who's holding a string or a rope in his hand, and it's attached to a hook or ring that's in the nose of the captive. Okay, so Horus is here giving his approval, giving his support, his approbation for whatever Narmer is doing, is being approved of by Horus, the sun god. And then behind him we have his vizier or sandal bearer. We'll look at this a little closer as well. So we've got his vizier here, and he's carrying the sandals of Narmer. Narmer's feet are bare here, and the vizier has his sandals in his hand. So there's a closer view of Narmer. He's got a royal beard on here, and I'm not sure whether this is a beard or whether that's a string. It might be a strap. It might be a strap that's used to hold the crown in place. So this is called the white crown of Upper Egypt. So the pharaoh that ruled out of Thebes, which is the upper capital of Egypt, he wore a very distinctive crown that looks rather like a bowling pin today. It's called the white crown of Upper Egypt. Now I'll show you a model of this that I made with some 3D software, because in my art history classes, I recreate as much as I can of the ancient world through 3D software and some little animated clips and so on to help us get a better feel for what this ancient culture was like. And so much of it is gone today or in ruins. So I try to recreate portions of it as I have the time to do so. And so I have recreated the crowns of Egypt for your amusement, for your edification, okay? And one of the things that I found, as you will see, is that it would have been very difficult to keep a crown like that on your head, right? And so it would just tip off, right, as you bent over or whatever. So maybe that's a strap that goes around his chin, and then the beard here is not because he is bearded, but the Egyptian pharaohs are usually represented with an artificial beard as a symbol of their authority, of their kingship. Anyway, here you see Narmer wearing his official crown, the white crown of Upper Egypt. And then here's Horus with the Delta region represented by this hieroglyph here, this iconographic image as the Delta region. Okay, the papyrus reads, here's an individual from the Delta, and he's being carried captive by this rope tied into a ring in the captive's nose. And then down here, an enemy who is being held captive by the hair by Narmer, as Narmer gets ready to strike him with his mace. And there is the battle mace, raised for the death blow, typical of the striking pose that is represented throughout Egyptian history as a way of symbolizing Pharaoh's power over his enemy and his military prowess. And then we have here the vizier with sandals. You got sandals in his hand here. He's carrying some type of a vessel there. I'm not sure what that is. Wearing a kilt and a necklace of authority. So pharaohs typically would give their viziers or their advisors necklaces that they could wear that would indicate to anyone seeing them that they were a person of importance and approved of by the pharaoh. Okay? So then here is the back side, or the other side, and it is interesting to compare the front and back. I'll show you both of them side by side in just a moment. But it is interesting to compare the artwork of each side because they apparently were made by two different artists. The side that we just looked at has a much more refined imagery or technique than whoever the artist was that created the images on this side. So again, this thing is only about 2 inches thick, and so it's a very thin slab of stone. So what we have here again is the royal name at the top, so that's that Serek, same one that we saw on the other side. And then the next register, so here we see clearly 3 different registers. The topmost register is the Narmer going to the battlefield with his entourage, his retinue, to view the battlefield carnage, to witness the dead that lie on the field of battle. Then the next register, we see 2 slaves apparently that have a couple of leopards in their control, which represents symbolically the unification of the 2 kingdoms by the intertwining of the leopards' necks. Now it is from this part of the palette that we get the term or the designation of this as a palette. It wasn't ever used as a actual palette. It's a ceremonial plaque. But the palette here is this recessed little dish-like area. And it would be in here that the black eye makeup, the so-called kohl, K-O-H-L, the so-called kohl, it's kind of like a mascara that would be prepared and ground up and mixed with oils or whatever to make this like a paste that you could paint around the eyes that is so typical of Egyptian makeup, right? This dark outlining of the eyes that was probably considered a mark of beauty, but also may have had the practical function of helping to reduce the glare of the bright Egyptian sun off the cheekbone up into the eye. Might have helped in that sense. Kind of like you see with football players today. They have these black patches or streaks of black on their cheekbones in order, that isn't there to make them look fearsome, although it kind of does that. But the purpose of that is to prevent the outdoor sun from striking the cheekbone and then diminishing their view of the football flying toward them. In any case, you've got the unification of the 2 kingdoms here. Have the question mark there because some scholars question that, but it seems to make some sense. Then the lowest register is of a bull. There again, that bull symbolism associated with the pharaoh, associated with divinity. Okay, so we've got the bull who happens to be destroying a enemy city and trampling on the enemy at the same time. So we'll look at these in a little bit closer view in just a second here. Okay, so there is the pharaoh. You see him here, hierarchic scale, right? Largest figure in the scene, and then in descending order of size, less and less important people. So this character, whoever that is apparently just as important as that character, the vizier, is. So it'd be interesting to know who that person is, although we don't really know. But there is a representation of the name here next to the front of the face, like there is for Narmer here. So you've got Narmer going out to view the battlefield with its numerous dead. So again, comparison to Narmer with the white crown. Here you see Narmer with what's called the red crown. Now this is the crown that had been worn by the king of Lower Egypt. Okay, so they each wore a different style of crown. Now what will happen is that, and Narmer is shown here wearing each crown to show his authority in that zone of Egypt, in that kingdom. But what Narmer will do after having conquered the lower kingdom, is he will combine the two crowns into the so-called double crown. And I'll show you my model of that in just a moment. Okay, so this is the red crown of Lower Egypt. And you see in front of his face his name again, Nar-mer. Okay. So we got the pharaoh with his vizier going off to visit the battlefield. And then according to an Egyptologist scholar, he identifies this as an unidentified female. So perhaps a sorceress or something of that nature, who knows exactly, but identified with her name here. And then we have standard bearers, so little guys, right, carrying these staffs that have the king's royal banners, leading the cortege to the battlefield. And then over here we have the dead. And there are 10,000 of them, right? So these are little guys, shown sideways, of course, so you can clearly identify what they are. But they're missing their heads, and their heads are between their feet here. There's 10 of them, so each one of those represented 1,000 dead, so 10,000 dead in this unification campaign. Then here we see the two long-necked leopards being held by collars and leashes. And it's here that the coal would, for a practical pallet, not this one, but for a practical pallet, the coal would be mixed here in this depression. Okay, so coal, K-O-H-L. And then down here, Pharaoh as bull, the divine bull, right? Destroying this city. You can see it's a walled city with defensive wall and towers, and then this urban area inside the palace, perhaps. So he's knocked down the wall, and he's taking control of the city while he tramples his enemies here underfoot. All right, so let's just look at Narmer wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt here for a moment. And again, if you look closely at the artwork here and the technique, you can see it's rougher than the technique that was used on the other side. So apparently two different artists are commissioned to work on this piece. So here's a model, a 3D model that might represent Narmer. Remember I told you they didn't like hair, so shaved bald, right? So King Narmer, and here he is wearing the white crown. I've modeled this white crown based upon the images from the artwork of ancient Egypt, because there are no crowns that have ever survived from ancient Egypt, strangely enough. So throughout that 3,000-year period, all these pharaohs wore crowns and headdresses and so on, but not a single one has ever survived. And we only know what they look like from artistic representations. And according to one Egyptologist who considered the reason why there's no crown, because surely you'd think that a crown would go into a tomb with a pharaoh, right? He'd take his crown with him. But apparently not. So according to this Egyptologist's interpretation of that, that he thought that there probably was only one crown throughout the entire period for the most part, one sacred crown, and it was passed on from pharaoh to pharaoh to pharaoh by convention or by tradition. And so there was only ever one, and it eventually, of course, disappeared. And so then here is the red crown of Lower Egypt. Okay, and some scholars believe that this rather interesting little device here on the front is perhaps a stylized representation of a feather. That's possible. And then here's the combination of the double crown of the two lands, as it was eventually called. Okay, so the double crown. All right, rather an interesting design, in my opinion. I find it quite beautiful in terms of its design. But then, for me, the Egyptians were masters of design. I think that they were just unsurpassed in the ancient world for being able to come up with beautiful designs for not necessarily their figure work, as we've talked about. That was very simplistic. But the design in jewelry work, in amulets, in crowns, and in various kinds of things that adorned the Egyptian, I find them to be unexcelled in their creation of those things. So anyway, my interpretation of King Narmer, rather aggressive looking individual here with his double crown. So that's the palette of Narmer. So the last thing that I want to address here before I wrap this up is, was King Narmer the Scorpion King? Now, some of you may be familiar with the Scorpion King. A few years ago, Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, was featured as the Scorpion King. Here's the marquee for the movie, The Scorpion King, Warrior, Legend, and King. Okay. So, of course, when this movie came out, most of us thought it was just purely creative imagination from the part of Hollywood. But there actually was a Scorpion King in ancient Egypt. I doubt that he was dressed the way that The Rock is dressed there. And certainly it's very anachronistic in this view, as oftentimes things are in Hollywood. And that is, this sword was a sword that was used in ancient Egypt later on, but would not have existed in this shape during the period of King Narmer. So a little bit of anachronism there, but it looks cool, so Hollywood's going to use it. And again, not so sure that they would have had scorpion breastplate there. Anyhow, the point is that the Scorpion King, most people believe that, most modern people today watching the movie would have believed that it's just screenwriters' concoction of an imaginative pharaoh. But in reality, one of the earliest kings in Egyptian history was known by the name of the Scorpion King. So was Narmer the Scorpion King? Well, let's investigate that here just for a moment, because he may very well have been. So as you look at the mace, you can see this is called the Major Scorpion Mace Head. And what you're looking at here is Narmer with his white crown, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, right? Now he's also standing on a river here, on the Nile River, because that's his domain, right? Is overseeing the Nile River and the irrigation systems like we talked about in our earliest lecture. And he's also carrying in his hand here a digging instrument that would be typical for digging furrows into cropland for planting and so on. But the thing that's interesting here is the name in front of his face here. So you look at that closer, and you can see that it combines this rosette, but the main element here is the scorpion. So this is where the idea of the Scorpion King comes from, is this image of the Major Scorpion Mace Head, just a ball of stone that would be attached to a stick. And this is a ceremonial one, but we have the Scorpion King here, and he is wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. Well, that's no indication that that was necessarily Narmer, but then we have this other one that's called the Minor Scorpion Mace Head, much badly damaged, unfortunately. But if we look at this one up close, here is the pharaoh, and he's wearing what? The red crown of Lower Egypt. And even though it's badly damaged, in front you can just barely see an indication of a scorpion right there. So, if the Scorpion King wore both the red crown and the white crown, as indicated in these mace heads, these ceremonial mace heads, then it would seem logical conclusion to draw that it was Narmer that was the Scorpion King, because he's the one that wore the two crowns, as we saw in the palette, and so apparently this individual who is wearing both crowns and is identified by the symbol of the scorpion would have been the Scorpion King, would have been Narmer. So kind of an interesting speculation. No proof of that, and many scholars would contest it. But I think this is kind of an interesting speculation. And so we'll end on that, and we will begin our investigation of the Old Kingdom with next class period's lecture. So I'll see you then.